So next I'm bringing up Mintek Kim, one of our amazing research managers from Boxer. Mintek.
Awesome. So how does this work? How do I flick slides?
I think they flick.
No, you got to press
The green arrow. Got you. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming to the session. There are two things I want to mention about this study straight up front. So the first thing is I want to thank Fan, my co-author, down the back who's doing the mic, as well as Stuart, who is the chair, who's been helping me out on this project, and Vivian, who's part of the Human Services Dataset team, deserves a big shout out for getting this presentation to happen at all. I guess the other thing I want to emphasize is this is very much a first look. You'll see it as we go on, but there's a lot of stuff going on in the study, and I've tried to kind of compress it to what you might be most interested in. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Okay, so setting some context. So thankfully, the keynote speaker did some of my work for me this morning, but policymakers are increasingly interested in using predictive models to target various policies. So predictive policing is the one that always comes up in the criminal justice context, but there are no limit to the kinds of things you could apply this to. So it's slowly being applied in courts for bail decisions and across kind of public policy in general. There are some pretty clear potential benefits to this. So improving the cost efficiency of existing programs by targeting them more effectively, being more consistent, and if it's this kind of revolutionary jump in predictive power that people want to sell it as being, then it could enable new types of interventions, right? But the discussion in this area, you essentially have to start with this idea of algorithmic bias and the idea that a lot of the metrics you're using to evaluate these models or these policies may hide important policy relevant variables that we want to take care of early on. So, important quote here. So there is an open letter by a group of mathematics departments in the US who have boycotted working with police, and they state in their open letter, it is simply too easy to create a scientific veneer for racism. This is a very loaded kind of charged area. Queensland Police are trialling an AI tool, much like the ones that our keynote speaker mentioned, to target domestic violence incidents. So this went into the field in 2021 in trials. And I think this really highlights the confidence that people are feeling in these models, these predictive approaches. So, they're not going to wait for a 000 phone call. They're proactively knocking on doors without any call for service. They're going out and predicting who's going to escalate further. The model that has probably been in the media or studied most in depth is the COMPASS tool, which is an all-purpose risk assessment tool that is commonly used across courts in the US to try and predict a defender's risk of reoffending. This study is a mechanical Turk study, essentially testing whether people on mechanical Turk are as effective as the COMPASS tool in predicting who is going to go on and reoffend. So researchers here will understand if you're young and have a lot of prior convictions, you're high risk is kind of obvious, is what the author says. So, the random people were able to understand this information and predict just as effectively as the COMPASS tool. But they responded by saying, actually, it's great that the COMPASS tool is able to predict as well as random people, and it matches the increasingly accepted AUC standard of 0.7. So, this is kind of foreshadowing. Another example I want to give to motivate my work is this paper by Mulanathan and co-authors. I've forgotten the co-authors for a second. And what they do is they investigate a algorithm that is commonly used in the healthcare setting in the US to screen people into a chronic disease program. So you can see here that the purple line is African Americans and the yellow line is white Americans. And you can see that African Americans are screened into the program at a higher rate, but they're actually screened into a rate that is far, far lower than the rate that would be suggested by the number of chronic conditions they had. So for every risk score that was predicted by the algorithm, the African American estimate was lower in terms of chronic conditions. This is because they predicted based on the cost to the healthcare system rather than the number of chronic conditions they had. So if this will pop up. It's really hard to study these algorithms. They're kept proprietary for very obvious reasons. The data is kept proprietary, the algorithms are kept proprietary. Without the training data, the objective function, the prediction methodology, you can only guess at why this is happening. So the researchers go ahead and try and figure this out based on the access that they had, which was the algorithm and some labeled data. Okay, so this is obviously happening in the context of many great studies that look at the association between various factors and criminal justice. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that these studies are much more precise. They're trying to achieve a very different outcome, and they're able to say a lot more than I'm able to with the analysis that I'm going to put in front of you. But there are also some barriers that mean that the studies that have come before me wouldn't have been able to study the problem that I'm looking at. So one is one that plagues us at Boxer. We have a reoffending database, not an offending database. So we can only study reoffending. We can't study first contact with the criminal justice system, which is what I'm going to show you in a second. Often a data on a subset of predictors. Every set of data is a data on a subset of predictors, but I'm going to try and motivate why my set of predictors is a policy relevant subset. And data at a point in time. So prediction problems are going to change depending on how far into the future you want to predict. And a lot of the studies in the literature, they're often misaligned in terms of the ages that they're trying to predict. So the purpose of the work that I'm about to present, a first look, is that we're trying to build an accurate, transparent model. We are building the algorithm. We have the data set. We have all the methodology. And we want to use, quote unquote, modern methods to predict first justice contact in order to then interrogate how well this could be used for public policy. So how accurate is the model? Is it this, revolutionary step that we've been promised? What variables drive the predictions of the model? Something slightly worse than associations, so kind of a decomposition of predictions. And how does the performance of the model differ by group? Okay, now on to the study. So what we've done is we've estimated a model on who will have contact with the criminal justice system as defined as having a caution, a youth justice conference, or a court appearance before the age of 18. And we actually run it 18 times, but for this presentation, we're showing it 4 times. So the data we have at birth, so all the administrative data we have on the parents, as well as all the information we have at birth, and we go kind of 10 years back from the birth, data until the age of 5, data until the age of 10, and data until the age of 15. So what we've done is we've gone through the data set and just chopped it at what we would have been able to observe at each of the ages for each of the people. We don't use any information that wouldn't have been available at that age, so we're trying to mimic the perspective of a predictive algorithm using the information we have. And once they have criminal justice contact, we've dropped them, mostly because we know that the most effective predictor of criminal justice contact is priors. So keeping the prediction problem consistent. Technical details here. Please feel free to ask me about these, but I'm not going to bore you with the details. I tried to pick out a subset of stuff that you might be interested in or might make you trust or not trust my results, depending on how you feel. We've used a gradient boosted model. One of the things we wanted to do with this project is take a lot of control out of the researchers' hands and have it be, quote unquote, data driven. So it handles the variable selection in the functional form essentially. And reassuringly, it's been shown in a number of studies to be the most effective approach for similar prediction problems like reoffending. It just generally performs really well, and for my benefit, it handles a lot of data issues really effectively. I'll move on from this one. What was our data set? So I said that I try and motivate the subset of variables we use. We use the New South Wales Human Services Dataset. So it's 60 services from across 10 agencies in New South Wales. So it kind of represents the linked collection of data that is collected by the New South Wales government. We have 27 years worth of data across 7 million records. I've taken 3 years worth of births from that data set. So I've taken 3 entire birth cohorts of everybody that was born in New South Wales in that time. So really don't know how to summarize the information in the Human Services Dataset. So I've just kind of thrown up all the major ones that I'm using up. It's a huge set of data. There's no doubt that there are many important things that I've missed in trying to summarize this as succinctly as possible, if the data is possible. but we have 343 predictors in the model, which is like 150-ish variables. I'm sure all the researchers in the room know how much of a mess this is and how much I'm hiding by just writing it up like this. But we're hiding behind the kind of machine learning approach, and that will then handle some of the issues we have with data incompleteness and the things we don't understand about our predictors. The dataset is a state government data asset, so no income, wealth, welfare measures, no preschool childcare, no MBS, PBS, plenty of other things we're missing too, but just reminding people that the Commonwealth dataset's not in there. Okay. Okay, so on to the results. So this is the part where I try and convince you that the model is good, so you should pay attention to the rest of the presentation, but not so good that you should, go using it and thinking it's incredible for everything, right? So why should you think this model is good? Well, it has 95% accuracy. That's a nice big number, very impressive sounding. And the AUC rises from about 0.77 to 0.882. So if you can remember the increasingly accepted standard, it is well above those metrics. The other reason that you think that it is a bit more subtle of why you should think this model is good is that we don't use the two, obvious ways that you predict offending, age and priors. By definition, by construction, we don't have those, and we're still able to achieve pretty good performance. So the model is performing pretty well at predicting offending. Reasons to be skeptical. 95% accuracy might seem high, but we have roughly 5% of people committing who come into contact with criminal justice. So if you were just to guess no for everybody, that would be a score of 95% in terms of accuracy. We obviously don't do that, but you just have to keep, you have to take these things with a pinch of salt. And it's much less effective when considering the group we care more about. So being a data-driven approach is going to fixate on the 95% of people who don't have criminal justice contact, so the accuracy is much higher there. For the people that we do care about, or care more about in terms of risk assessment, we see that we have about a coin flips chance. So the precision is about 50%, which means that about half the people we predict to go on to have criminal justice contact do. And even more worryingly, at birth, we can predict like roughly 0% of the people who go on to have criminal justice contact, and that rises to about 20%. So even at its best, it's performing, only catching about a fifth of the people that we want to detect. Of course, you can always increase the precision and decrease the sensitivity based on the threshold of risk you use to designate someone as likely to have contact or not. We'll get to that. But this is what it looks like at its kind of basic calibration. So what is driving this contact with criminal justice in the model? I've been referring to this as kind of like a catnip for armchair theorizing, but this is what our model is doing for non-Aboriginal people in terms of what the predictors are. So it's, for those of you who haven't seen importance scores before, this is breaking down the prediction for each individual person and seeing what has the most influence on the prediction, above or below the average prediction. So you can, the real thing, the best way I think to conceptualize this is that 95% of the sample don't go on to have criminal justice contact. If the thing that you thought would appear there is not there, it's probably because it has a small proportion of people who experience it. So a good example might be your parents being in custody. Probably has a big impact on the people who are in custody, but because the vast majority of people in our data set do not have parents in custody, that means that it doesn't show up. The ones that show up have the sweet spot of impacting quite a lot of people, but also having an influence on the prediction of whether they're going to go on and have a criminal justice offence. Up top, not heaps to work with in terms of the information we have on the individual, but you can see by age 5 we're having ROSH reports that are starting to play a role in the prediction. Gender is always important because it has a big influence and it is very predictive for a large number of people. And then by age 15 we have lots more information on the individual, so suspensions start to play a bigger role in the prediction. So we've split it out for non-Aboriginal, Aboriginal people, but the variables, the patterns of variables are very similar. I think here you can see with the suspensions, that's why I said 150-ish variables, but like 350 predictors. We have something like 6 or 8 measures of suspensions. We didn't know what would be important in the prediction, so we threw them all in. Okay, so now onto the bias section. So just as there were big differences in accuracy between the high-risk group and the low-risk group, there is also very big differences in ways that you think about bias. So one of my pet peeves is trying to talk about bias in a kind of precise way. So there's the systemic bias of the criminal justice context leading to differences in the way that the criminal justice system is interacting in general. But then moving into the modelling, we have this bias that's created by the outcome being, so having criminal justice contact, even though you have the same behaviour for two different people, you've got a kind of outcome bias or a labelling bias, and then you've got a variable bias in that the services that are used by each of the individuals may differ. They're not the same, right? And then there's this kind of third level of bias, modelling bias, which can exacerbate all those problems again. So here we're going to concentrate on modelling bias because it's very difficult for me to interrogate the other biases, and going to try and understand predictive accuracy and false alarms. So does the model perform better for one group rather than the other? And does the model falsely predict contact differently for other groups? You can ask the other question, does it kind of under-predict for groups as well? So answer the question one. So on the bottom here, you've got the threshold value, the risk score that's used to cut off whether someone is defined as likely or not likely to have justice contact. You can see for Aboriginal people, it always performs worse. Essentially, you would never use the model below 50 anyway, so it just stays worse for Aboriginal people in terms of its predictive accuracy. And for the false alarms, you have a kind of a similar problem. So how to read this chart, you can see that for 9.4%, the false alarm rate is 9.4% for Aboriginal people and 0.01% for non-Aboriginal people as kind of default calibration. But say that you chose to make it, you chose to push the threshold value, you can generally find a point at which the false positive rates are going to be equal for the groups and bias is acceptable. But once you do that, then you have the opposite problem. You're always trading off these false alarms for these missed alarms. So you can see up there that you start building a model that you essentially miss all non-Aboriginal people in your predictive model. So you end up with a kind of a different kind of problem. So increasing the threshold in practice, you're probably not going to be able to do because you need to enroll people into your model, into your program. But these things really make it obvious, I think, that you need to think of these risk scores as program-specific or context-specific. It's very difficult to construct a risk score for all applications and just use it consistently across contexts. So this is well understood. There's a cranky guy named Burke talking about this. Concerns about accuracy, fairness, and transparency are real. There are trade-offs between them for which there can be no technical fix. So there are various things you can do to try and make these problems better. We have worked on it, obviously, but you're always going to have to think about these issues. Okay, so what did we do? So just recapping, we cleaned a large policy-relevant data set and constructed a potentially useful data set with a lot of predictors. We built a predictive model. It seems pretty accurate, especially by the metrics you might be given by a proprietary body who wants to tell you that the model is good. And we were able to decompose the model and show what kinds of things are driving the model and what might be useful as like a minimum set to do predictions if you didn't have the whole data set. But unfortunately, the model still has a lot of issues that you would want to consider if you were going to use it as your primary way of targeting services. So big differences in accuracy, pretty hard to sell the model based on accuracy if it's performing so differently for different groups. Big differences in false positive rates. So if you were doing something like knocking on people's doors, you probably would want to think about this a bit. And the magnitudes that I've presented, they've been pretty high level. The reason is because small decisions in how you tune the model in terms of the groups you're looking at, change the magnitude quite significantly. So you really want to think about, which group you want to do it for and how you want to tune it for any given policy purpose. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mintek. Does anyone have any questions for Mintek? One up the back.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I just have a question on your variable selection. So prior to building your model, did you use the 150 variables available, or did you go through a process to decide what variables to use for your model?
So because we were given a large set of raw administrative data files. Our main problem was trying to figure out how to preserve as much information from each data set into variables. So, before we looked at it, because it was all in different formats, there were essentially no variables. We had to construct all of them, and then every single one that we constructed because we thought it might, in some setting, help with prediction. So all 150, I've been surprised at the people I've shown this to, what things they notice are missing from the board. So health people will say, I'm surprised more health stuff wasn't there. So we just threw everything in, and we kind of have taken a bit of a hands-off approach there.
Any other questions? Do you have a question? No? Okay. Well, thank you, everyone.